All right, everybody, we're going to get started. I think everyone's got their food. Today's speaker is Jon Lovvorn, who is the Chief Counsel for Animal Protection Litigation at the Humane Society of the United States. I've known Jon for over probably about 12 years or so.
Let's not talk about it.
And he is truly one of the most insightful and experienced litigators the animal protection movement has ever known, honestly. Any major development or case involved in the field, Jon has either been directly involved litigating or had a hand behind the scenes in strategizing on. And he actually was the chief architect of the Yes on 3 question ballot initiative in Massachusetts that passed in November. Yay. Which many in the room helped with significantly, which passed by 78% with 78% support from Massachusetts voters, which was the single largest margin in U.S. history on an animal protection ballot initiative. So Jon and I both got interested in law initially for environmental reasons and ended up going into animal protection work. And it's interesting to see Jon cycle back and now start kind of connecting the two of them. So I will, without further ado, let him tell you more about that. Thank you so much, and give me a hand in welcoming Jon Lovvorn.
Thanks, Chris. Now that we've set the bar nice and low, I think that's really good. I'm going to talk a little bit about animals and climate change, try to get done in time to take questions, although as Chris and others can tell you, I have a lot to say. So thanks for coming. You're sparing everyone on my team from listening to me gas on about climate change, as I will do for extended lengths. But I'm going to talk a little bit about a paper that just came out in preview at the Georgetown Environmental Law Review on climate change and intersectional threats. But I'm going to focus on the animal aspect of it. Number of ideas in the paper about the intersectional aspect of climate change, and in particular with regard to animals. But the interesting thing about the analysis is we tried to go at it from the standpoint of, rather than sort of bemoaning identity politics, trying to identify how the issue of climate change resonates within established public interest causes. So then we can then look at how there are commonalities and how the differing impacts on social justice movements interact with each other and really amplify within the context of climate change. And so just a quick roadmap of where we're going to go. The key point, of course, being that climate change has to be conceptualized beyond environmentalism, which is not remarkable in and of itself. But climate change, although most animal advocates are aware of it and concerned about it, it has not been a top ticket animal protection issue for a long time. The other thing we'll talk about a little bit is the issue of animal agriculture and climate change emissions. And that relates directly to the need for the animal protection community to activate on the issue of climate change, not just within the agricultural sector, but across the board. And then the really important need for animal advocates and environmental advocates to work together. This is a historic alliance that has led to so many of the major policy victories of the last century. It's something we need to expand on, reactivate, and take advantage of. And then the last piece, which was more controversial before the election, was that we're going to have to look at consumers, corporations, and the courts for our solutions rather than executive branch actions, legislative actions, or things of this nature. So I want to start with a short clip, assuming we can get it to run, to give you an idea what brought me to this issue, in the sense that I was humming along, working on various animal protection issues. I was aware of wildlife protection and its connection to climate change. Social scientists believe that people get involved in particular causes because of a series of sort of social shocks. And for some reason, this particular video is the one that triggered my journey into this issue. So let's see if we can get it to run here.
I'm on the phone with Jim on one of our regular check-ins. Jim, nothing's happening.
Jim, it's going well. We had some serious bouts of wind, but other than that, things are fairly well set up here. We've got some continuous time lapse going.
It's starting, Adam. I think. Adam, it's starting.
Oh wait, Jim, this is the big piece is starting to cast. Let me call you back.
Call him back. Okay, bye.
Still going?
Yeah, in that V section right there. Holy shit, look at that big bird rolling. All four running, right?
Yeah. Look at that. You see how? Look at the whole thing.
Calving face is 300, sometimes 400 feet tall. Pieces of ice were shooting up out of the ocean 600 feet and then falling. The only way that you can really try to put it into scale with human reference is if you imagine Manhattan. And all of a sudden, all of those buildings just start to rumble and quake and peel off and just fall over and roll around. This whole massive city just breaking apart in front of your eyes. We're just observers, these two little dots on the side of the mountain. And we watched and recorded the largest witness calving event ever caught on tape.
So how big was this calving event that we just looked at? We'll resort to some illustrations again to give you a sense of scale. It's as if the entire lower tip of Manhattan broke off, except that the thickness, the height of it, is equivalent to buildings that are 2.5 or 3 times higher than they are. That's a magical, miraculous, horrible, scary thing. I don't know that anybody's really seen the miracle and horror of that. It took 100 years for it to retreat 8 miles from 1900 to 2000. From 2000 to 2010, it retreated 9 miles. So in 10 years, it retreated more than it had in the previous 100.
Okay, so I highly recommend the movie Chasing Ice for anyone who hasn't seen it. Why do we spend so much time on that? We've heard about ice breakup, loss of ice. We've heard about all the different impacts of climate change. I like this slide because I sometimes like really busy PowerPoint slides that you could put in a competition for bad PowerPoint. But we've heard all the arguments. We've heard about melting ice. We've heard about increased temperature. Every year we get the announcement that it's the hottest year Then the last, the most wild weather. We know that we have millions of Americans and their companion animals and their farm animals and other animals all living within a few feet of high tide. We need just a little bit of a nudge to have a mass need for some 20 million American climate migrants. Most of these people will be people of limited economic means and people of color in the Southeast United States who will have to move inland to places where people might not necessarily want them to go. We're totally unprepared for that. Same with situation with regard to water. We got a little bit of a preview of it with the California drought. My brother lives in Phoenix, which makes this map particularly alarming for me. But these shifts are going to have real impacts on people, and the connection with regard to people and animals is undeniable. The other thing about climate impacts that's really important to think about is they're not equal opportunity threats. Climate change impacts are profoundly discriminatory. They fall hardest on the most vulnerable elements of society. So people limited to economic means, vulnerable populations, vulnerable native populations, and of course, animals being some of the most vulnerable aspects of our society. So one way to look at this as an example is just take a look at Hurricane Katrina. After Katrina blew through, they did demographic data, and the #1 indicator of whether or not you died in Katrina was whether or not you could afford a car. That was #1. #2 was race in terms of whether or not you risked mortality. Elderly also took a big hit, but the one that they don't really talk about much in the research is animals. And in fact, the connection between loss of animals and loss of people, because a large number of people who stayed during Katrina stayed because they were unable to take their companion animals with them, because at that time, FEMA evacuations did not allow people to bring their companion animals. So the choice was drop off your dog at the curb and get on the bus or stay. We've since managed to change that. Paper talks about a lot of impacts of climate change and other issues. The Syrian civil war has huge components related to climate change associated with it. I'm not going to be able to spend a lot of time on all of these areas. If you have a lot of time on your hands and 80 pages you want to read, you can read the whole paper. But I did want to pull out one statistic because this one really shocked me, which is that the prediction for heat wave deaths by 2030 are likely to outstrip non-suicide gun violence, gun deaths. So think of all the people we have working on the issue of guns and gun deaths in comparison to how many people are working on the issue of climate change. So this isn't some far-off prediction for 2050 that we're talking about. We're talking about things happening in the next 10, 15, or 20 years. And that's one of the things that pushed me to explore this with regard to animals. I will admit I was somewhat in denial, not in the sense of I deny that climate change was happening, but I literally thought this was something that people were going to have to worry about in 2070, 2080, 2100. I'd be dead and gone. My work would be done. It would be someone else's problem. But you know, this connection between human impacts, impacts on animals, and climate change is very real, and it's somewhat staggering. One very recent example was the case of anthrax in Siberia. And essentially, after a long period of not seeing any anthrax, they had a sudden outbreak. And they couldn't figure out what had happened. And what they discovered was that a reindeer carcass, the animal had died of anthrax some 90 years ago, thawed out during warm weather from the permafrost. And then animals fed on that carcass, and then humans ate the meat from those animals. So anthrax literally emerging from the permafrost. And another study about a year ago said we can look forward to smallpox emerging from frozen bodies as well. So as these increased heat melting goes on, these human and animal viruses are going to reemerge There's discussion of bubonic plague. I could go on and on and on, but there's a major connection here. And I also want to talk about animals because the reality is animals and humans and climate change have gone hand in hand from the very beginning. Animals are the original climate adaptation. Human society is founded and began on following herds of animals for hunting purposes, and then ultimately domesticating animals. Human energy sources were totally animal dependent for thousands and thousands of years. The original oil product came from whales, and the industry was huge. And over time, got larger and larger and larger. We know the impact that had on whales. But this idea of animals as energy and a climate adaptation goes back to the beginning. We relied on horses for thousands of years as our primary mode of transport. And then, of course, we switched to petroleum, the invention of the internal combustion engine. And we all know about the direct impacts of human use of petroleum. This is the BP oil spill. This direct evidence we've seen right in front of us. But the indirect impacts, the ones we don't see, are by far the much larger impact with regard to animals. And what I discovered after looking at this issue for a while was that outside of factory farming, and we'll talk about the connection in a second, climate change is the single biggest mortality factor for animals worldwide. It dwarfs every other issue we work on with regard to animal protection in terms of the numbers of animals suffering and dying with regard to climate change. This was a surprise to me. I was focused on poaching. I was focused on other uses, exploitation. But climate change is the runaway winner, and it's going to hit and is already hitting hardest within the marine environment. So we've seen some of these predictions about sixth extinction, loss of 2/3 of wildlife. That's all true. It's hard to overstate the incompatibility of human activity and occupation with animals. Two quick examples of that. One of the most biodiverse areas remaining in Central Asia is the area where they have cordoned off around Chernobyl that humans are not allowed to enter. So the nuclear disaster site is one of the best places for animals. Anyone know what the other big biodiverse spot is in the world? The DMZ between North and South Korea is a huge hotspot for remaining biodiversity, literally covered with landmines and armed to the teeth. So anywhere where humans can't go at all tends to be the situation. Now, it's true that climate change has winners and losers for animals. Not every change in climate is going to result in the death or destruction of animals. And some animals will migrate, those that are able to. But there are some limitations on migration. We have natural barriers. We have mountains. We have rivers. We have oceans. And then there are other barriers that can have a huge impact on animal migration as well. The other problem with regard to migration and adaptation is that the vast majority of warming is going into the ocean. And the ability of ocean animals to migrate away from the heat or adapt is much more limited. And what we've seen over the last 24 to 36 months are some pretty shocking and unprecedented die-offs within the ocean environment, which, I'll be clear, have not been categorically tied to climate change or warming, but multiple events of hundreds of thousands, millions of animals dying in the ocean environment. And, you know, from Tasmania and mutton birds to mass die-off all the way from Baja California to Alaska in the summer of 2015. I actually found one of these birds while I was vacationing in Monterey and took it to a rehabber. Didn't know at the time that it was part of a mass die-off, but was just sitting on the beach, not moving. And so we see these die-offs increasing in the oceanic environment, and we also see them upland. So in 2015, we saw some 200,000 endangered antelope die off in Central Asia. Some of you may have seen this. Huge number of animals. And what happened when we looked at the cause of this particular die-off was really, really troubling. What we discovered was just a few degrees increase in the temperature had taken normally harmless gut microbes for these animals and turned them into a vector that they couldn't survive. And so, like that, just a slight increase in temperature, and these animals' own gut bacteria killed some 200,000 of them. What this suggests is that animals are far more susceptible to climate change than we may have thought, when something as small as this can kill so many animals. Okay, so I'm glad no one has left yet, because this is all getting very depressing. How bad are we really talking about? How bad is it going to get? Well, the definitive analysis, the meta-analysis, suggests anywhere between 5.2 to 16% of species will go extinct. But the problem with talking about species, and species are great and we should preserve species, is it doesn't really translate into numbers. So for example, when I talk to you about the number of people that are going to die from heat deaths from climate change, I didn't do that based on species or cultural origin or X number of cities are going to experience. We talk about lives lost in very concrete terms. When we talk about animals and climate change, we tend to talk about abstractions and start talking about percentage of species. So one of the things that the discussion of species level loss leaves out is the reality that there are huge sub-extinction losses of animals, millions of animals for each species that goes extinct. So for each species that we drive all the way to extinction, we're killing millions and millions of animals. Huge numbers. I won't get into the details. My paper theorizes that it could be as much as 147 billion animals over the next 20 years. And when you look at this, we have animal agriculture, of course, always the hands-down winner when it comes to killing animals. But when you move beyond that, what you find is climate change coming in a pretty strong second, especially in comparison to some of the other things that we work on. And so what is the animal community doing about this problem? Essentially, we're on the bench. I try to include some cute pictures to make it less depressing. This is not something that the animal protection community is fully activated on. And it is something that we're going to have to get activated on. And I'm sure someone is thinking, well, actually we are, because we're working on, advocating a vegan diet. But simply, smugly telling people to stop eating meat is not a full climate change control strategy for the benefit of animals. This is a much broader problem. At the same time, environmentalists have a problem too. And it's fine and well to dress up as polar bears in order to try to get people to realize that there are lives at stake. But the reality is, every single major policy gain of the last 100 years has been done in cooperation between environmentalists and animal protection advocates. And even when it wasn't an open cooperation, we see environmental groups using animal imagery and people's concern for the plight of animals in order to advance their agenda. And unfortunately, there is a long-standing split, at least academically, between environmental law and animal law. This has been of interest to me for a long time. This is sort of the infamous piece by Professor Callicott suggesting that animal ethics and environmental ethics are inherently incompatible. Tom Reagan, who just passed recently, and I feel bad about even putting up this slide, did a whole lot for the cause of animal protection, but labeling environmentalists environmental fascism probably was not among his greatest achievements. So this division has sat for a very long time, and I don't have time to go into it. But if you go back and look at the luminaries within the environmental movement and some of the things that they say, they certainly did not believe in some kind of fundamental divide between animal protection and environmentalism. If you read Walden, it reads like a piece of animal advocacy, the connection that Thoreau felt with regard to humans and animals. John Muir talking about the benefits of evolving to a vegetarian lifestyle. Rachel Carson spoke eloquently on the issue of animal protection and its relation to environmental protection. And interestingly, she was viciously attacked, as we know, by the chemical lobby. Do you know what they called her? Anyone know anything about Rachel Carson? They accused her of being a crazy cat lady. They actually called her a crazy cat lady. And the interesting thing is, she was a crazy cat lady. She served for a very long time on the board of advisors for the Animal Welfare Institute and saw this very strong connection. And I will just talk briefly, but the idea of animals and the loss of animals is really at the foundation of so many of environmental achievements over the years. This is a bison skull pile, by the way, from the late 19th century. But you know, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was really passed because of the gruesomeness of market hunting and the excesses that were going on. When President Nixon signed the Endangered Species Act, it's not only clear he wasn't real sure or clear what he was signing, but it really wasn't scientific arguments that pushed that over the edge. It was the majesty of the whooping crane was a centerpiece of this statute. Marine Mammal Protection Act was images of baby seals being clubbed. The Oil Pollution Prevention Act of 1990, images of dead birds covered in oil. Can go on and on and on. Even the most iconic environmental fight of the 20th century over old-growth forest in the Pacific Northwest was not made based on the majesty of the trees themselves. Instead, we had our spotted owl. This same thing holds true with regard to climate advocacy. So you don't see, thankfully, climate advocates relying too much on slides like this. And you don't even see climate advocates talking about this. This is the village of Kivalina in Alaska. It's a native village that is literally going underwater. They tried to file a suit to do something about it and failed. No, instead, we usually talk about polar bears. Now, there is nothing wrong with environmentalists owning more polar bear suits than animal protection advocates. It's fine. I've got no problem with it. But what I do have trouble with is maintaining any idea that there's somehow an incompatibility or a split between two movements where the imagery of one is so frequently used by the other. And so that really brings me to the second paper, which I haven't written yet, so I'll call it quits here. No, some of the themes in the second paper are what are we going to do about this, especially in an era where we're not likely to see additional regulation. And one of the things the paper focuses on, really the heart of it, is trying to figure out how we're going to do something over the near term with regard to climate change. Because the reality is animals are literally the canary in the coal mine. So the loss, death, destruction of animals that's already underway is the precursor to the same thing happening to human populations. So if you care about one, you really have to care about the other. And one of the biggest problems is people don't understand climate change. Highly recommend this book if you want to get up to speed in less than 2 hours on climate change. But the most important thing is climate change and carbon, CO2, they're not like ozone. It's not like you ban hairspray and then in a few years, everything's fine. No, we've got a much bigger problem. It takes thousands of years for carbon to get out of the atmosphere. So we already have so much carbon that even if we parked all the cars, turned out all the lights, appointed Bill McKibben president or supreme ruler of the world, we're going to keep heating for a very, very long time. If you want to see your carbon that you put out today, either driving here or what you chose to eat or however else you did, you can check back in on it in 10,000 years and 15% of it will still be waiting for you. So what this tells us, again, is somewhat depressing, right? Carbon control, although really important, is going to take a very long time to have any kind of impact. But there are other greenhouse gases. And if you look at this chart and you're interested in short-term mitigation, one of these is not like the other, right? So methane is critically important. And one of the things the EPA did over the last few years before the Obama administration left was start to turn its attention very strongly to methane, which for years has somewhat been ignored in climate advocacy and climate circles because it was so short-lived. But the reality is now, if we want to do anything over the next 20 years, methane is essentially the only gas we've got, because cutting CO2, although we have to do it long-term, is not going to stave off any of the immediate impacts. Methane is over 80 times more powerful than CO2 and dissipates in a very short period of time. So one of the things we have to do is take, even though it's a much smaller component, it's much more potent, and we know what all the sources is, although EPA tries to hide, essentially, what one of the major components of methane is. Anyone know what enteric fermentation is? Yeah, gas from cows. And we're going to put it on the other side of the chart from manure management from animal agriculture, because someone might add them together and find out that animal agriculture and other agricultural uses are the largest source of methane emissions. So what does it look like in terms of trends? Well, bad news, people eating white rice, any of it that is made in wet rice production is just about as bad as eating a hamburger from a methane emission standpoint. And if you really want to go for it, have steak and white rice for dinner. But the three things that we have to do are we have to deal with oil and gas, we have to deal with landfills, and agriculture, both animal agriculture and high emission plant agriculture like rice. So we have new regulations, although they've been challenged with regard to oil and gas wells. We have new regulations with regard to landfills, and then we have the regulations with regard to agriculture that they put out. Wait, oh, sorry. Joe put them here somewhere. There's nothing. This entire sector of methane emission is completely unregulated. Not only is it unregulated, but EPA doesn't even know where it's coming from or how much. We and a number of other groups have sued in order to force them to at least measure this source of emission, and it's just not done. It's the elephant in the room in all climate discussions. It's not in the Paris Agreement. It's not in the Clean Power Plan. It's not in any of the proposals that the Obama administration put on its website, which have now been removed. But it's a huge issue, and it's something we have direct control over. And I know people are thinking, oh, don't give me the vegan talk, but I'm not going to talk about animal welfare at all. But unless we come to terms with this issue, there's absolutely no way to meet any of the climate targets, and certainly not mitigate our short-term problem. There's a lot of different estimates. Some people say 8%, some people say 14.5%. The UN says that. Other people say that animal agriculture is somewhere in 50%. But whatever it is, I submit to some degree, it's excess, and it is optional, and it is gratuitous. And let me give you an example. Imagine that Exxon decided they were coming out with a new product. They wanted to get ahead of their competitors. And they decided, we're going to have flavored gas, scented gas, right? So you don't have to drive around in a boring, regular smelling car. I can have banana smell coming out of my tailpipe, right? Or strawberry, whatever it is. So we're going to extract the petroleum. We're going to ship it. We're going to refine it. But we're not going to send it to the gas station. Instead, we're going to ship it again and go through an entire secondary process where for every 7 gallons in, we get 1 gallon of fancy scented gas out. Then we are going to put it back on the truck, and we're going to sell it at the gas station so that you can have aesthetically pleasing gas. The reaction would be massive. No one would stand for us doing this with regard to the energy sector. But in simplified form, this is exactly what we do in the food sector. We grow food. We do not send it to the grocery store. We ship it sometimes halfway around the world. China imports 60 million tons of soybeans from the Amazon every year to feed livestock. And then we put it through a secondary process, where for every 7 calories of plant protein we put in, we get 1 calorie of animal protein out. And a big byproduct of your manure lagoon there. Then we put it back on the truck, and we send it to the supermarket so you can have your aesthetically pleasing food. So there's an enormous amount of waste in here. And when you add it up, you're talking about 20 times more greenhouse gas emissions per calorie, per gram of protein, sorry, for pork. Same number with regard to poultry, and a whopping 150 times with regard to beef. Okay, well, that could be manageable, except unlike energy sector emissions, agricultural emissions are on their way up quickly, especially in countries like China that are in a big hurry to get up to Western levels of meat consumption. So even if we pass over the Rainbow Bridge into Fantasyland and the Trump administration decides they're fully on board with climate change regulation, we fully implement Paris, Clean Power Plan goes forward, Obama administration's reductions are adopted, the state civil war over climate change regulations is dropped, we're not going to meet it. Even the projections and plans that the Obama administration had in place are insufficient, indisputably insufficient, to even meet the Paris Agreement's goals. And essentially, what is clear is there's other areas that we're going to have to regulate or reduce emissions from if we're going to meet any of those targets. And it's, you know, I just can't figure out where we could possibly look. I mean, I don't know where we're going to find the emissions. Okay, well, maybe we'll think of something. I don't know. It won't be the EPA is not going to help us in this regard. And I don't think we can look to Congress or the executive branch to help us. And, you know, in all respect to climate advocates, I don't think that charts about temperature increase are necessarily going to get us there either. I love this slide. It's so awful. It's wonderful. Arguments about what's going to happen in 2100, these things are not going to move the ball. You know what moves the ball? See? People's emotional connection to animals, and we'll talk about children as well in a minute, this moves policy. So one of the things we're going to have to do, and I talk about in the paper, is we're going to have to look to consumers, corporations, and the courts to try to answer some of these problems. And in doing so, we're going to rely on a few bedrock conservative values. First, we're going to rely on corporate responsibility. And the fact of the matter is that virtually everything that emits emissions is sold to you at some point. It's your choice whether you buy it. So consumers are really in the driver's seat with regard to this question. And that brings us to personal responsibility. Obviously, we have to take responsibility for our own emissions. So we're going to need, to some degree, answers from both Wall Street and Walmart in order to tackle this particular problem. We make choices all the time about high carbon footprint food, high emissions food, high methane food, or lower. We do this in our choices about how we get from one place to another. And one of the things that the paper is going to look at in depth is whether or not some of the corporate campaigns that we've used in the humane community and legal campaigns could be a roadmap for additional change within the climate sector. Over the space of 10 years, we've fundamentally changed the nature of how animal agricultural products are marketed. And rather than having hundreds of corporations suing to overturn regulations like we do with regard to the Clean Power Plan, what if we had hundreds of corporations going out of their way to do things that benefit the climate because their consumers demand it? Interestingly, the 2015 questionnaire about what people look for in the supermarket, animal welfare was number 2. Climate emissions wasn't on the list. How is that possible? There's a tremendous amount of room for action here. There's also room in the courts. Claims are made with regard to products and sustainability that, to put it charitably, don't pass a straight-face test. These have to be policed up. We have policed them within the humane space. We've gone after people engaged in labeling things as humane. We need to do the same thing with regard to sustainability claims. We've already seen New York's Attorney General going after various industries with regard to their claims with regard to climate change. This needs to expand. And I said I was going to get back to kids. There's actually very interesting work being done with regard to children and climate change, including the case out of Oregon. And if you're interested in this, take a look at our Children's Trust, really doing groundbreaking litigation work with regard to climate. And this is important because people often say the animal protection community needs to be more scientific. Truth of the matter is the science shows that we need to be more emotional, that that's what actually works. The science shows that people are naturally drawn to cute animals and cute babies. So if you want to look at the science, what it says, essentially, besides answering the fundamental question of our time, and if I do nothing else today, I've taken care of this question, but that these kind of arguments don't work. This is what works. And you know what works even better? This. Now, if you have any doubt about this, about the use of emotion, about the scientific basis for arguing emotional arguments for change, I urge you to take a look at this particular work, which talks about voter decision and emotions. Being scientific about animal protection means triggering people's emotional desire to protect animals and their emotional desire to protect children. These are the pathways that work. Talking about abstract questions of species, abstract questions of sea level rise, and unfortunately, because of this hardwired connection with animals and children, people care a lot more about the plight of animals and children and climate change than they do about entire communities being wiped out in other countries. And just with regard to this, I just threw this in this morning, there's new data out today from Yale's annual survey on this. And you can see that people don't think global warming is going to harm them personally, but they know it's going to hurt people in developing countries. And so the reality of the situation is, whether we like it or not, we can decry the fact that people care more about animals and children than they do about entire cultures disappearing from climate change. But we know how to make this change, and it's within our grasp. And if we don't do something about methane consumption and methane emission, very soon, a lot of things are going to happen that we can't pull back from, including the death of tens or even hundreds of millions of animals. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Those of you who need to leave for class can do so, but we still will take have time for a couple questions if anybody has any. Anyone? Bueller?
Everyone runs screaming from any discussion of climate change.
Questions, anybody? Okay, here we go. They're recording, so they'll bring you the mic very next. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming. I actually have a question about the relationship between the animal rights activist community and the environmental community. And that's what happens in situations where policy alignment actually does pit them against each other.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of situations like cat eradication
Yeah.
in Tasmania,
Yeah.
where you have native species that are being killed by cats, and you have animal rights activists that want to make sure that the cats aren't eradicated.
Yeah, and it's a good question. And the reality is, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this because of my interest in the connection between environmental law and animal law, and I actually spent a long time trying to figure out, could I ethically resolve it, essentially? And the fact of the matter is, there are times where interest in individuals and interest in the collective conflict, whether it's within the situation of animals or people. So I don't think it's necessarily resolvable. I think it's a natural, it's less about environmentalism and animal protection and about collective versus individual. So I think in those circumstances, it's important to follow the science, and the cat eradication, in most of the cases we've gotten involved in, there's a level of hysteria going on that just the presence of cats is going to hurt wildlife without any actual studies in that particular area. But I think the dialogue is important. Following the science is important. I think the fact that animal advocates and environmentalists can disagree on 1% of the issues they have a commonality in is okay. You know, I wanted to fix it for a very long time, but we could have a discussion about collective interest versus individual interest in any number of policy areas involving people too. So I think we're obligated to work through those in as respectful a manner as we can and let the science decide where we go. And there are going to be times where there's just an irreconcilable conflict. Great question.
Thanks. Obviously, images of children and lovable animals are very effective in moving people. But I'm wondering if the fact that our very home is the planet, if we could sort of work in the idea that if someone's attacking and destroying your home, you have every right to do something about it.
Yeah, I think that these arguments are already in play with regard to climate advocacy. I think that I was focused on arguments that need to be interjected that aren't currently there. The situation about homes is very interesting because the reality is, for the most part, the people who will be first affected with regard to their homes or their ability to survive in a particular area are people with the least power in society and the least money. So when you talk about, and I had the slide up about people concerned about whether it'll impact us in the United States, I think most of the wealthy policymakers are thinking, I will move to higher ground, or I'll be okay, or I'm insured. It's all the people who have nothing and can't afford to lose it that are in a really bad place. So I think we've made arguments about loss of entire cultures. We're going to see it, and we're seeing it already with regard to climate change. And sadly, in the United States, it is not resonating. But I still think there's a place for that argument, and always an argument with regard to the ethics. I think the ethics of destroying all of this with regard to our obligation to future generations is a hugely important one. But as I mentioned, it was one I was perfectly willing to just ignore until I realized that this stuff was going to happen in my lifetime, and then suddenly I'm out giving talks about it. So.
Thank you again for coming today, John. My question is, you mentioned methane is sort of like a low-hanging fruit and something that we can affect. But most environmental advocates and people who care about climate change talk about carbon dioxide. Do you have any thoughts about why people have been so focused on that and less emphasizing of methane?
Yeah, I mean, it made sense for a very long time. Carbon is forever. And nothing I said here should be taken as an argument to go carbon it up. You know, I mean, obviously, we have to do something about carbon. But the feeling was that we didn't need to worry about methane too much because you cut off the methane spigot and it dissipates in 8 to 12 years. So what we really needed to do was focus on carbon. We now are above 400 parts per million. We have so much carbon that even if we stopped, we would have continued warming. So what we have to look at are other places within the emission spectrum where if we cut it, we might have some short-term mitigation. How much is an open question. But I think the other thing about methane is that climate advocates for a long time we're promoting natural gas as an alternative to petroleum, and natural gas production has a lot of methane escape. So it just has not been a real focus. In fairness, since 2012, there's been a number of papers and a number of actions, and like I said, the Obama administration came to the realization that the carbon problem is getting away from us, and we need to shift to things that we can control. Unfortunately, they shifted so late that almost all of their methane-related regulations are within the time frame for the Congressional Review Act and subject to congressional repeal, which is where I think they will. So if we lose any regulation on oil and gas and landfills, and we never had any on agriculture, that means it's up to consumers, corporations, and the courts to save us, because nothing else will, because there's nothing there.
I'm trying to connect the very, very good points you made. A, that methane is what needs to be focused on in the immediate future because it's the only thing that one can get rid of fairly fast, and it's very powerful. And that the arguments featuring cute children and cute animals are the winning ones. How do you put cute animals and cute people into we have to do something about methane argument?
Yeah, well, I think that's the key. I think, as with our Children's Trust litigation campaign, we have to make people understand, and this is what the paper was about, that climate change is not an esoteric environmental issue about rising sea level and mean temperatures and species loss. It is a concrete existential threat to humans and animals. And within that space, I think impacts on children and impacts on animals are the most persuasive arguments. These are the things that actually move people to change their behavior. And I think in terms of operationalizing it, I think corporate campaigns that highlight these facts are what needs to take place.
But I mean, already the polar bear, is a symbol of climate change.
And the polar bear's out there.
But it's not tied with methane at all. Methane is so much about factory farming.
Yeah.
So how do you cross that bridge?
Well, I don't think there's a bridge. I think there's operational. There are issues in order to operationalize this argument. And the interesting thing about factory farming is it is both a cause of massive animal suffering and a cause of climate change emissions. So I refer to it as a double header of misery in my paper. That's where I think that it's one thing to tell people you should be vegan because you should care about farm animals. A certain number of people are going to take action in response to that. My belief is a much larger portion of people will take action if you tell them you should reduce your animal product consumption because it's going to hurt animals and children. And when I mean animals, I mean wild animals that resonate with people in the way that farm animals don't. So, yeah.
Good. So what you've seemed to say is that, number one, we need very, very drastic and immediate action. And number two, that the existing repertoire is essentially courts, consumers, and corporations.
Yeah.
It just seems that they're so far apart that there's not really any hope of the first being achieved with that repertoire. So I wondered, firstly, how do you think that could be expanded towards more kind of controversial actions to which the state would not take kindly?
Yeah.
And number two, where would you place the NGO or civil society community in between those three, and where they can best exert pressure?
Yeah, I mean, these are really good questions. I mean, and especially as regards to other countries, I don't think we should give up at all on international agreements or other international pressure for what I would call traditional command and control methods of reducing these emissions. And I think to the extent that other countries are doing it, it impacts corporations because corporations are multinational. But one of the things I wanted to be really clear about in my paper, having spent 20 years in Washington, D.C., and then having watched the recent election, is there's no amount of banging our head against the brick wall is going to regulate these emissions in the traditional command and control capacity to the degree we need them to do. I believe that the Obama EPA was doing the most that anyone could have ever expected without being entirely defunded by Congress if they'd gone any further. And the science says it wasn't enough. So I think it's going to be really hard. I mean, I think it's going to be very hard to get individual consumers, corporations, or legal actions to control these emissions. I also think if we don't do it, we're not going to control them. I think your point's really well taken, which is these remedies are weak remedies. I mean, I'd much rather see some type of command and control scheme that did serious cuts, but I don't believe it's possible in the United States. So I think that's a huge difficulty. Yeah.
Thanks so much for coming today and providing that broad picture of how animals and climate change are inexorably interlinked. I was just wondering, after mentioning your 3 Cs, what room there is for another C and an S, cities and states, to actually strongly regulate in this area. Specifically the case of California, who has strong climate caps on the books and are starting to move out of CO2 already and monitor nitrous oxide and methane as part of their climate change regulation.
Well, I'm really glad you raised it because it was one of the slides that got cut because they wanted me to do 25 minutes and leave a lot of time for questions I didn't even get close. But yeah, these state and regional efforts are really important because along with consumers, corporations, and courts, it's all we've got left. I'm a little concerned that the federal government is going to come down and preempt those, especially things like California's program. I think it's hugely important. And I think that to the extent states like California say we're going to have these really strong programs, I think that supports consumers recognizing that these emissions are inappropriate, and I think that reinforces personal choice. So the stronger California's own regulations are, the more likely California consumers are going to take a pass on things that have a very high climate change input. We saw this with regard to animals. So when California passed a fairly modest measure phasing out certain types of extreme confinement, it drove the market even further with regard to humane treatment of farm animals in California. So I think we're not stuck with just corporate and consumer efforts. We do have these state and regional, but I haven't leaned on them too much because I'm just worried that rug is going to be pulled right out from under us. As soon as California does enough to have a big impact on any powerful industries, Congress will try to move to preempt them. But for the meantime, I think they're doing really great stuff.
Okay, great. We're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you, everyone, for giving me another hand, and thank you, Jon Lovvorn. I'm sure he'll be willing to stick around for a few minutes and answer any remaining questions. Thanks again.